most surprising thing you learned in doing research for the new publication of Acharya S, Christ Conspiracy? How do you think your views differ and converge with hers? Derek Bennett.
She is much more centered on the Astro theology thing. I do not say I disagree with her, though, because I hold to the very unpopular view now among scholars that a number of especially Old Testament characters are originally stellar and lunar and solar embodiments. This was the view of Max Muller, and then the great scholar of Old Testament and Islam, Ignaz Goldziher, a Hungarian scholar. In his book Mythology Among the Hebrews, he explains in great detail how the names and or the stories of loads of Old Testament characters mark them as originally astrological entities which they thought had personalities, like, you know, the sun. And it was a later development to say there is a god of the sun, Apollo. No, it was originally the sun. And then there's the step down to a god in charge of it, and then a demigod begotten by that god who has some of the same powers and responsibilities, but was fathered by a mortal woman, like the sons of God, daughters of men, which is another case of the same thing. And then eventually they start humanizing them and saying, well, all right, there was no god Apollo who had a chariot in the sky, but the real Apollo probably ran a big tanning salon in Corinth or something. And of course they didn't say that, but they did say there must have been a Hercules. He was a great strong man. There must have been an Ares, god of war, but he was just like the Norman Schwarzkopf of the ancient world. It's like a kind of a version of ancestor worship, and and that is, of course, still what is said about Jesus. And I believe Acharya is saying that Jesus, the Buddha, and others were originally the sun. Well, I can't say that's wrong. I mean, it's pretty striking when you suggest that the 12 apostles are the 12 signs of the zodiac, just like the 12 labors of Hercules certainly were. And there's the story where, but it starts, it's an embarrassment of riches, because she would think of Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. In Mark, his clothes begin to glow like no launderer on earth could bleach them, it says. And that's like it's like a Buddhist story. They're seeing the heavenly form of Jesus that always exists, but that is shrouded from the unenlightened. Origen said that different people saw Jesus differently depending on their level of perception. In Matthew, it's a little different. Jesus' face glows like the sun. Well, that sounds even more solar, but he's probably borrowing it from Moses. And now Moses must have been a sun god. So does that show that is that evidence that Jesus was a sun god, or that he's the new Moses, and that Matthew, who made this redactional change, no doubt was not even aware of the astrological stuff? It's hard to say, and there's so many other things that seem to feed into the Jesus character. But again, you got to wonder, well, what was the origin? And what she says could well be true. I mean, even the idea that Jesus was a kind of Jewish version of the god Soma, the visionary mushroom of Vedic religion. I mean, people hear about John Allegro's thought Jesus was a mushroom. This guy's crazy. He's wearing a tinfoil hat like Price. No, I mean, it might be hard to prove. It might be very difficult I mean, there's more evidence for other views, but we know this is what they did with Soma. They personified the stuff into a god. And so when you have an analogy like that, you can't just laugh it off, but you have to say it's speculation when it is, and so on. Let's see. One place where I don't agree with Acharya is she speculates that the similarities between all these ancient religions, East and West, were the result of a big conference where the leaders of these religions got together and sort of did committee work coming up with Jesus, etc. I think you really need some kind of evidence for that. Not that it couldn't happen, but that seems like an unprecedented ecumenical thing, and it's unnecessary anyway for her own view, because the strength of the astrotheology thing is you can explain the similarities between the religions insofar as they're based on the night sky that everybody sees. So I don't think you really need the one if you've got the other, and the other one seems less plausible to me. I guess that'd be the chief thing. She in the first book, the first version of the Christ Conspiracy, she brought in all kinds of extraneous, weird stuff that really does not bear on this. And like the maps of the ancient sea kings, there's some belief that certain maps we've discovered show a more accurate outline of the continents or something than we otherwise thought they could have known. And so on. That's dubious anyway, but who cares for the sake of this? What does that have to do with the historical Jesus? And she got into weird conspiracy theories. She said the Pope is the master mason and all of this stuff. Nah, but even if it's true, it just doesn't matter. But she quickly dropped all of that stuff. And she realized it just wasn't germane or wasn't defensible. And already in her later books like Christ in Egypt and Sons of God and so forth, you won't find any of that stuff. But what you will find is an astonishing depth of research. Stuff like the connection of Dionysus and Moses. I never heard of that, but she shows from ancient sources that many thought they were the same. And one thing that I kind of called her on originally was the old theory by scholars who are now considered sort of pseudo-scholars that there were representations, either like sculptures or drawings of sculptures that no longer exist, of crucified gods that might have been intended as Krishna and the Buddha and so forth. And some of that is pretty iffy, but she had a point. This is really kind of strange. I mean, tell you what it's just like. Archaeologists have discovered in, I think it was Mohenjo-Daro, this ancient lost city in India, there was some sort of a bas-relief with a man, a human figure, sitting in the lotus position. He had deer horns coming out of his head, and he's surrounded by animals. Well, that's pretty striking. There's something virtually identical found in Ireland. I mean, that's so weird in a way. How would that be coincidence? And Jan Puvel, I think a Finnish mythology scholar, points out that you can kind of you can plot the expansion of mythology along the same track as the expansion of language and the Indo-European languages. I mean, that's all, through Europe on into India. And so you would have to assume that as people carried that language and its offshoots geographically, their myths and so forth went with them. And so You know, and so I began to think, yeah, we sort of can explain this, but that's consistent with Acharya's theory that there was a more widespread commonality than modern scholars are willing to accept. And you know, the other day we were talking about ideal types and such, and I may have meant to mention at any rate that it's sort of I think a bad development that even very erudite scholars have sort of forgotten what an ideal type is. Like Helmut Kester in one of his books talks about the mystery religions and kind of laughs off what an earlier generation of scholars said, that, okay, here, Mithraism was a mystery religion, and this was, and that was, and they have these points in common. And he said, well, really, they're just like secret societies or some, but they don't have that much in common. Yeah, they do. And it's like he's saying, since they're not like Xeroxes of one another, we don't need to bother with the similarities. Yeah, I'm afraid we do. And that's sort of going on here too, that you or the thing with the Astro theology, the arguments given by Goldseer that Samson was a sun god and so on, you can't just say this is out of fashion. What do you make of this? I mean, this is intriguing, compelling evidence. It doesn't mean nothing. Conservatives and apologists will note oddities in early manuscripts and things that don't seem to fit the standard view of the development of Christianity, and they say, well, where there's smoke, there isn't necessarily fire. It doesn't really mean anything. The stuff is anomalous, like Irenaeus thinking that Jesus was crucified in the 50s under Claudius. That doesn't mean anything. I mean, I'm not sure I know what it does mean, but you better have some way of explaining this. But instead, it's like I said before, if you can't prove the standard story is wrong, we're just going to keep believing it. And it's like you just suppress. It's like, once again, Thomas Kuhn. You come up with a new paradigm for understanding anything, physics, whatever, by starting with the anomalous data that the old paradigm didn't know how to explain, like the retrograde motion of the planets. I don't know what this means. When we get to heaven, we'll find out. But instead, you say, wait a minute, let's start with that and work our way out and see what the results are. And you may find it enhances the traditional theory, which is basically what it did. I see, we had the orbits wrong. They're not orbiting the sun, the Earth, they're orbiting the sun. And you may improve and not have to just reject the old view, but they're singularly unwilling to do that. Or Bruno Bauer, in his book Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity, he goes into all kinds of odd little things, like the fact that in, I think it was Edessa, where Christianity caught on real early, the first ones, and those who were first called Christians there, were Marcionites. And once Catholic Christians came in, they had to call themselves something else, so they became known as Paulicians, after the Bishop Palut, who brought Christianity there. Walter Bauer, I hope I said. He said, no, that's got to mean something. And if you look at a bunch of other weird little sore thumbs sticking out, you find that they do indicate a pattern that undermines the traditional view that Jesus taught the disciples, they taught the bishops, they taught us, and that's it. Anything else, people are just hallucinating. And you have to start with the weird stuff.
Interesting. So I got a comment real quick, because Derek Bennett's the one who asked this question. He wrote the Dying and Rising God theme that's in that book coming up.
Great piece, too.
You liked it?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I can get your comment on that. And one thing in that vein of the Dying and Rising God, to get just a brief little, because I know you probably have something to say about it. I just wanted to ask you on that. And the crucified Savior Messiah type thing. That's a theme. Someone wrote 16 crucified Messiah book, and I had Christopher Hansen recently on the show. Brilliant, well-read kid. He literally goes out of his way, in my opinion, to like absolutely not accept the ideas of mythicism, in my opinion, even though love him to death. He makes the idea that like this is all bogus. It's already been debunked and proven wrong. Now, my question about the crucified Messiah one, because we can go into Dying and Rising Gods after this, so you just comment on Derek's and then we'll move on. The crucified saviors, how strong do you think that idea is? I mean, you show a lot of overlap with other stuff, right? It wouldn't shock me if all this other stuff has similarities. They don't necessarily have to be crucified, I guess, but there is a night sky celestial body that seems to look like a cross. And is this valid, the person who wrote this book? I'm sure you've read the book.
Kersey Graves, I think.
Have you heard his criticisms from people? And what do you think he had anything there? And do you think the criticisms were valid?
The criticisms are valid because when he wrote, not much was known. And in fact, some of the crucified saviors he talks about are really the same guy, with different spellings of the name and all that. So it's a notable book, but it really is kind of outmoded. And he also has this business where the Buddha was supposedly crucified. There's not really evidence for that, or Mithras. I've heard that said, and I wrote to the great authority on Mithraism, David Ulansey, and I said, is there anything to this? I've done a bit of study of Mithraism, doesn't sound right to me. He says, there's nothing to that. So who knows where they got it? They're pushing some of these things way too far.
Right.
But like Acharya brought up, the crucified Indian deities that may be intended as Indra or Krishna or whatever. I'd like to see somebody give a good explanation for that because we don't have much data on it. But is there data that suggests that this was a real mytheme of dying and rising gods and so on? Well, yeah, I think so. Though it's not the whole package like it is with dying and rising gods like Tammuz, Osiris, Hercules, Attis, Adonis, and so forth. But there are crucifixion parallels, like Cleomenes, a radical king of Sparta, who was sort of a communist, who wanted land reform and redistributing the big estates to the poor. Well, this didn't go over well. He got deposed and chased out of whatever Grecian city-state it was. And he went around the Eastern Mediterranean fomenting this Green New Deal kind of thing. And he was finally caught up with in Alexandria, but in Egypt somewhere. And the authorities killed him, and or maybe they were on his heels, and he and his followers. It may have been like Masada, I forget, where they killed each other rather than falling into the hands of their persecutors. And there's a scene in that where when the Romans caught up with them, they checked by poking them with a sword as to whether they were really dead, which sort of reminds you of the thing in the Gospel of John with the spear. That's not that significant, but then they exposed the bodies on crosses, just like in the Old Testament, they hung up the corpse. You didn't die on the cross. Well, they put Cleomenes up there, so he was a crucified king, a champion of the people, but dead now, and it says that his women disciples gathered around the cross and testified that a snake, I think I've heard one version where a snake wrapped itself around Cleomenes' face, and another one where it said that an eagle or a vulture or something perched there to frighten away the other carrion birds because they didn't want them defaced. And when they saw this, they said he was a son of the gods. And I have to say that is too close for comfort. The rest of the story doesn't exactly fit, but that really doesn't make any difference. Also, I make a big deal in, I guess, deconstructing Jesus and the Incredible Shrinking Son of Man about popular novels. We have like at least 3 of them from that period. We can't define it exactly, but it could be right around the 2nd century AD, where there are these ill-starred lovers are separated. The woman, the fiancée, they're like in movies, the couple is always rich and they're more interesting to people. And they entomb her thinking that she's dead when she's not yet. And she's rich. And so these tomb raiders see that this empty tomb is now filled. And they say, oh yeah, they were rich. I bet there's all kinds of goodies in there. Funerary tokens, as they called them. And so they opened it up. And wouldn't you know it, just about now, the woman is waking up from the coma. And they say, oh my God, here's a witness. What are we going to do? I said, well, let's take her with us and sell her as a slave. And so they do. Well, her fiancé shows up to grieve at the tomb and says, it's open. What happened? He goes in there. He sees the funeral shroud, but there's no body. And he says, the gods were jealous of her beauty and they've taken her up to heaven. And then they realize what's really happened. And so he goes after her to find her and goes through these wild adventures. And eventually he is condemned to be crucified. And he is crucified, but I may be mixing them up, but in one of them, I think it's this one, the cross is not well planted in the ground, and a gust of wind knocks it over into the river, and he's able to get out of the ropes, and eventually they meet again, and it's like, you're alive? I figured you must be dead by now. And it's, are you sure you're not a spirit? And so you have the empty tomb, the false death of one character, and the crucifixion and survival of the other, and a reunion scene where they think you must be dead, right? No. And there are 3 of these that we know of. There may have been more. And this is another one where Bart said there were no such novels. Oh yeah, take a look. Here they are. There's an anthology of them. And so you have to wonder, it's the right time, it's the theme, and it does kind of fit with the docetic view of the crucifixion, that he didn't really die. So I think that has a lot to do with shaping the gospel story. So even the one thing that they say has to be true about the historical Jesus, if anything is, it might not be true. There might be no crucifixion, even if there was a Jesus. So that's not part of the complex of a worshipped, dying and rising God, but it's pretty darn close. So there's that. And with the standard dying and rising gods that originated as agricultural or solar myths, I just don't see how you can discount the parallels. Again, it's a failure or an unwillingness to accept what an ideal type is. That they're all clustered around this Eastern Mediterranean thing. They all seem to have the same basic script, including the holy women looking for the body, whether it's Isis and Nephthys or Cybele or Anat, whatever. And some of them are hundreds of years older, demonstrably, than the New Testament. And so I just don't see how anybody can say that.